Well, welcome back to a new episode of the Win More, Live Better podcast. And today's guest is going to be a little bit different than some of the other guests that I brought into. We're going to can stay with the theme of bringing in a thought expert, a leader in her respective space, which I'm extremely excited about. Today, we're going to be joined by Dr. Suzanne Bell. And Suzanne and I have got to know each other a little bit over the last couple of years. We were really fortunate to bring Suzanne out to be a featured speaker at a leadership summit that we hosted with the Arizona Diamondbacks a couple years ago, and it was fantastic. And so I'm just really excited to create a space for others to learn from your expertise and the work that you're doing. That I find, again, my childhood like passion for astronomy and learning about outer space and all that. This is me kind of fanboying a little bit here in this conversation. So more than anything, Suzanne, I'm just honored that you were willing to take some time to have the conversation today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and it's nice to see you.
Yeah, yeah. I think where I feel like probably is a helpful starting point is for those that might be unfamiliar with your work and what goes into the role that you play for NASA and all the expertise that you're bringing into it. I think it'd be helpful to kind of provide some clarity around that. But I'm also excited because this conversation is coming at the conclusion, or at least the execution of the Artemis 2 mission that just wrapped up this past month. And so I'm really excited to kind of peel back maybe some of the layers, a little bit of that, at least some of the maybe the front end work that you and your team played a role in. And I think that maybe is a good starting point is for you to maybe kind of share behind the scenes what your role looks like for NASA and maybe what some of that entailed as it related to the Artemis 2 mission.
Okay, I'd love to. I lead the Behavioral Health and Performance Lab at NASA Johnson Space Center. And what we do there is we problem solve issues related to teamwork, behavioral health, individual and team performance for the astronauts, but also how they relate to mission control. And so when we think of what NASA looks to do in the future with a sustained presence on the moon and going to Mars someday, we think about, well, why can't we do that today? And then what kind of supports can we put in place to make it possible for humans to do that? And so I lead that lab. As you mentioned, we just came off of the Artemis 2 missions, very exciting time for our country and really the world. But with that, humans went the furthest that they've ever gone from Earth and did a flyby around the moon, getting important data for us so that we can learn both what it's like to move beyond low Earth orbit on into deep space, but also collecting data about the moon so we can prepare for landing and the future Artemis missions to build that presence on the moon. My lab in particular, we led the Artemis research for crew health and readiness. And so, what that is looking at four pillars. One is how the crew works together as a team and how they interact and work together with mission control, making sure that that's in position for everyone to be successful. We look at behavioral health, so looking at their mood, their way they're thinking, the way they're behaving as individuals, not just as teams, and how we can best support astronauts of future missions. We also look at how the human interacts with Orion, which is the small vehicle you saw them flying around in, and figuring out, what are the processes and different systems we can put in place to help humans best survive and thrive in that circumstance. And then the last part is sleep. So we collaborate with our sleep and fatigue lab, led by Dr. Erin Flynn Evans, and she and her team help us understand how sleep might impact all those things I just talked about. So it's a nice interdisciplinary effort. We collected data before, during, and after the Artemis missions and are in data processing right now. So we have some quick turnarounds so we can inform Artemis 3. So wonderful experience, very much my pleasure to be a part of it and such an important journey and still in the thick of it because we're still looking at the data, but really, really honored to be a part of that mission.
Still looking at the data, obviously, as you mentioned, for a project that, as you mentioned, has worldwide implications and an impact, if you will. But at the same time, I know this is also a lot of prep work and important research for what's upcoming too, with future missions. Where I'm where I'm interested to go is you kind of describe those four themes for a moment. So much of what I appreciated as I've gotten to know you is this like blend between, science and practice and having that deep appreciation for research, but then also how do we make this practical? How do we bring this to life? I think in order to do that, sometimes we have to have clarity on, well, what are the questions and problems that we're really trying to solve? And so when you think about some of those themes that you and your team play an expertise and a role in, what would you say are some of those kind of core questions that NASA is wanting you to answer for them and for the missions, but also some of those core problems that you and your team are trying to uh, solve in an interdisciplinary way?
A couple simple examples. When the Artemis 2 launched, the first thing that happened is they went around the Earth twice. And what they were doing there is testing whether or not Orion could sustain life. That was the first time humans had been on Orion. They were testing the systems, testing the piloting systems before they moved on and went beyond and moved into deep space for the first time since the Apollo era. During that time, because they're rotating the Earth, they're orbiting the Earth, and they have to test all these systems, they're compressed for time. They had to fit a lot into their schedule. So one of the things we knew is that they wouldn't get adequate sleep. Well, we know that sleep is critically important to performing, particularly in high stakes environment. I mean, you wouldn't want a baseball player who goes up to the plate sleepy, right? We don't want astronauts interacting with these complex systems sleepy either. But we also knew we needed to test all of those things within that period where they're around orbiting. So the sleep lab tested that with the crew on the ground ahead of time. And then when you get into space, it's infinitely more complicated because you no longer have gravity in the same ways. Now you're living and working together in that small space. Now you have the emotions of the mission. And so then we were testing that live. So we tested on the ground, make sure it could work. But then we also tested and are looking at our data to make sure it was not only successful, but were we pushing a little too much? Is it the right amount? Where are we positioning our astronauts for success as they do increasingly complex missions? This first mission was just the start. We're going to ask them to do harder and harder things. And so knowing where we can push like that and what the data looks like, or if that's already enough of a push and we have to kind of back off a little bit to help missions be successful. That's just one example. Another really key question is, what's it like to live and work in such a small space for a long amount of time? 10 days is not that long, but in our future missions, they're going to get longer and longer. And you're talking about something the size of a camper van, no privacy, the team having to interact seamlessly and coordinate almost like a beautiful dance as they move around in microgravity. Where can better procedures be put in place to make that effective? What did they learn along the way that can help us to train future crews? So it's all very practical questions combined with this pushing the envelope further and further as we move along.
One of the things that when we first started connecting and learning a little bit, one of the things that stood out to me quickly is just the process. First and foremost, we're kind of going to back up for a moment here. Just to become an astronaut is incredibly, talk about a gauntlet, which is probably an understatement in many ways. But there was a line that you shared when this was the line that I was like, "Ooh, I gotta reach out to Suzanne." And this was the line that at first kind of drew me to your work. You shared in a prior conversation that a team of experts doesn't always equate to an expert team. And I think that certainly can tie into the selection process, if you will. So, with what you could you maybe give folks who might be unfamiliar with that process to become an astronaut, maybe kind of a high level overview of just how daunting that is, how challenging that is, but then also that idea of teasing apart why it's not just finding the most talented individuals and really how you build that expert team.
Yeah. So what happens in the astronaut selection process is we have lots of applications. So a lot of people have dreamed of being astronauts as kids. And so sometimes we'll have 16,000, 18,000 people apply, for something like 8 slots. And so it's right there. You are figuring out, how do you even get through these different applicants in a way that's systematic, that's fair, that's really assessing their potential to thrive in this type of environment. Um, and so I can't remember the specific part we shared, but basically there's an extensive process. Then later in the process, one of the things that's looked at is behavioral health and performance related competencies. So there's two later stages of screening where we start to look at those competencies. Those are publicly shared, but examples of this would be adaptability, teamwork, and so there's quite a few others. But when someone applies to be an astronaut, they've often had a career or been further along in the process. So we are, by the time we're selecting these like top eight, we advise to the selection committee, the behavioral health operations group, and my lab also supports that. Um, you're really talking about accomplished individuals, what we think of as top performers. But you also, in this circumstance, like in many other circumstances, also want someone who can work well as a team. And so thinking about, is this someone who can be a part of many teams and succeed? Is this kind of a star who might not be a great team player? Teasing that out in the process so you can get, competent engineers, physicians, all the things we need, and the different types of astronauts we need, geologists, but also then, can they work together? Because when we do things like go to the moon, go to Mars, it's going to draw on those different expertises that they all have to work together and translate into an effective mission, which, no one person can do alone. And so that teamwork component, as well as many of the other components like adaptability, whatever comes their way, being able to emotion regulate, those are all really important competencies for, our future astronauts.
To build just slightly, excuse me, to build just slightly maybe on that, I would imagine that there are some of those competencies that become even more critical as those missions get longer, right? And then there's certainly more uncertainty, there's more stakes, in many ways, more challenges that emerge within that. Um, could you elaborate? And the reason I guess I'm asking some of this too is, I'm thinking about pro sport, obviously, which is where most of my work has been. And you're talking about people, in essence, living together, staffs, groups living together, in essence, and working together for such an extended period of time. Certainly raises different challenges, in many ways, while you're also trying to do your job. So I'm just interested if you could share just a little bit as to what you think are some of the, or what have you all found some of those unique maybe competencies that become even more important for those longer missions?
And you're exactly right. We look across different potential mission profiles and say, okay, what are the more important competencies for this profile versus another? One of the things that really emerges, particularly when you're talking about long term isolation confinement, is this skill in group living. So, having consideration for others, being tidy, you have to put things back in space so they don't float around and are exactly where you found them because things take a long time to do. Same thing applies, when professional sports teams maybe are living together, particularly in the developmental parts. There's something to be said for that group living skill. We actually published a paper last year. Dr. Lauren Landon in our lab led it, but it's publicly accessible and free to use, but it's got a great 6-item scale where you can gauge people's group living and then track it over time and even provide training in the areas where maybe they're not well equipped to live as a group. Why it matters? Well, when you live and work together, we like to think we can compartmentalize and say, nope, the relational stuff stays over there, the living together stuff stays over there, but it just trickles over into the work. It's so commingled, whether it's in space or in a lot of professional sports teams. And I think people underestimate how much carryover there is from that. Examples can be if something like a subgroup forms. So maybe there's tight knit groups that form kind of within the larger team. Uh, that has to be carefully monitored, and you have to consider whether or not there's commingling across those groups that's very healthy. The reason is because sometimes when subgroups form, we tend to communicate across those boundaries less. We can have conflict across those boundaries. We might not be focused on the same shared goal and might start to create our own goals. And so it's really important that the team goal stays priority. And sometimes the subgrouping can happen just in the way we relate to each other, whether it's because we're living together or just like each other more. And so making sure that the team as a whole is coming along nicely an important component when you both live and work together as a team.
You made me think as you were describing that it's a great example where, play out this scenario, which is a scenario that has happened to me and I know others where, when you're living or in essence you're working together with a staff day to day, as you mentioned, as much as we want to leave home at home, the reality is there's often that residue that we bring in, and sometimes that shows up in how we communicate, our tone, our body language, kind of just how we're showing up in a different environment. The question that maybe actually comes up for me as you describe that is how important then have you all found it to be for groups to be really well connected, not just from a working standpoint, but also, somewhat knowledgeable of each other's lives, or, how what role does that play, maybe almost like that vulnerability in essence, within kind of the composition of teams that you've seen.
Yeah, so you there's kind of a couple interesting I'll respond to this in a couple of ways. One is that relational aspect can be critically important. And in the context we're talking about, whether it's in long-term isolation and confinement or professional sports teams, one thing we have to remember is that a typical individual gets social support from several areas, right? So someone might get it from their supervisor at work, or from their family at home, or from their coworkers, uh, or from the public, from the press, for people who are in the press a lot. And so when we change the situation, like in space, we're in long-term isolation and confinement, or we do analog studies where we have people right now in isolation for 378 days. They have less contact with their family, and they are on a communication delay of what we expect from ours, which is 8 to 22 minutes. When you introduce that delay, what can happen is, and we published a paper on this last year, is that people tend to rely on the team more heavily. So those external sources of social support are constrained. So that makes them hyper focus on the team and the support they can get from the team. When the team is cohesive, it can provide that social support, both emotional and instrumental support, helping them meet their goals. But when it's not, that you're really leaving the person with very little social support. Not only are they estranged from their typical sources, or at least, have limited communication with them. And then on top of that, I wouldn't say estranged because it's just limited communication. They're still connected. But then on top of that, you're now hyper focused on the team. So when you look to the team for that, what we find is that teams that are able to provide that social support, people are less stressed at the end of the day. They're able to rely on the team to get the work done, to help them meet the team goals, to meet their own goals, for that emotional support.
All right, quick pivot here. In case you've been tuning in, all of a sudden we did a little bit of a jump cut here. We had some technical difficulties on my end, but I I want to keep our conversation going. I don't know exactly where we left off specifically, but the question that I also was kind of curious about is, with all the expertise that you bring in, not just through NASA, but all the different teams and organizations that you've researched, that you've studied, that you've supported and served. I'm interested, kind of to take a step back. Are there like common breakdowns that you're seeing the most when it comes to teams and pertaining to like teamwork in particular? And just what are some of the things that you found to be most helpful or practical to kind of troubleshoot those, which I know can vary depending on the context, but just kind of curious, what are some of those biggest breakdowns that emerge?
It really is often dependent on the context of what the sticking points are for a team, but some kind of commonalities I see across places. One is that we constantly are managing this our own individual goals versus the team goals. And it seems like whether it's organizations or sports teams or really a lot of places, you have these individuals with individual goals, whether, they have aspirations in their baseball career or they, just have their work goals that they want promotions or whatever they want. And so how do you balance that? That is a tricky thing, I think, and it really needs thought, particularly when it's set up in certain ways. But a couple of tricks with that. One is a leader can use something called individualized consideration, where they help people, they see people for the individual that they are, and they also recognize that this person has strengths and motivations and desires of their own. But as a leader, you're trying to accomplish this team task. Understanding that person's motivations can be helpful because then you can connect it to the larger task. So let me help you achieve this, and we can do that by working together to meet these objectives. And so instead of ignoring the fact that people have their own kind of individual motivations, making sure you get to know the person, what motivates them, what else are they trying to achieve, because a lot of times they are compatible with the team goal. People just don't see how necessarily and need the leader to tie it together for them. Another issue I've seen that's pretty common is people think that they can compensate for bad team players. And they, see this superstar, they see this just technical expert who's amazing, but maybe on a engineering team, they're just like a really poor communicator. Or a sports team, maybe they're a star, but just awful people and teamwork skills. And so I think people overestimate the value of that. For me, I'd rather have a really solid person, or know what I'm dealing with that, and then build the team around that deliberately. But I think people think, oh, it'll work out, and it really doesn't. And so making a concerted effort to recognize that teamwork is a truly part of the skill set that's needed. And then if you are knowingly taking someone in who's got difficulties in how they work well with the team, what are you putting in place to support that? It has to be deliberate. It has to be thought out. It has to be thought out in terms of the reward system, in the training, and how you're supporting the rest of the team. It doesn't just work out. So those would be two. I mean, I could go on with other things I see, but maybe that'll get you started.
One thing that comes up as you describe that is I'm almost thinking of what can be done from a leadership standpoint proactively, in essence, with teams. And then the other side of it is like, okay, how do we troubleshoot some of these team chemistry, team functioning oriented challenges more reactively? I, some of that I think ties to what you just described, but I'm curious, like if you were to kind of build on those two, are there helpful practices that you've seen across different spaces in either of those camps?
Yeah. So when you first reached out to me now a couple years ago, it was actually for my team composition work. And we know that some combinations of people work better together than others. And so it's not just about having a skilled individual and someone who has generic teamwork skills that are good, but it's also thinking about how the combination of people work together, where they best complement each other, where they can provide the complement that the other person needs to really shine. They can help make each other shine and create a better team. Um, what people do is they often say, well, I'm kind of stuck with the team that's given, or maybe I can, maybe I'm limited by these factors, but that's okay, because even thinking through the complementarity of people can help you think about how to best support that team. One of the things that matters for teams is having good norms. So norms are informal rules of the way you interact. Okay. Picture a team that naturally has very good team players on it and are very complementary in their teamwork. Now picture a team that they're just going to have difficulty with that chemistry and gelling. You just have to be more deliberate. What are you doing to help that team bond? What are you doing to help them really see the compelling direction and shared goal so that they're focused on that more than the differences and problems they have with each other. And then along the way, what are supports we can do? So, for example, do we need to have a team based bonus if it's not naturally emerging? But norms, you think of like a locker room or something like that. They always have like the five things that that team's working on, like we're dedicated, teamwork. People choose different ones. I always look at those and I always think, well, how do people choose those five out of the like 20 you could have built on? Well, what they should have done is not only understand what the value of the organization is, but then think about the team that they have. Like, what is the thing that is most likely not naturally to emerge in that team? What's the helpful norm? So, if you have people who have really ridden on their talents in the past, but maybe don't show up to um, practice in the way that you wish they would, like that can become a norm that you enforce, that you have in your slogans, that like we practice hard, we play hard. Does another team need to hear that? That might not be what you want to preach to them all the time. And so it's not that practice hard, play hard isn't important for every team. It's just that is that the thing you're reinforcing over and over again to really help that team build that norm. And so I think of team composition, but then understanding the team's composition to figure out what's naturally going to emerge and what do I need to do as a leader to coach them along to helping those norms fall in place so that they have that really synergistic teamwork going.
I think it's a great point. I remember going to a corporate company a couple years ago and speaking, and I had done some homework on the front end to find out what their mission was and some of those core values. And I remember being in an executive meeting in the workshop, and I asked them, like, all right, like what's your mission? And like you could tell, like no one, like they kind of piecemealed an answer, and I put it on the screen, and I was like, oh, just in case you didn't know, But the point being, I think there are times where we for different reasons, organizations, you have those values, you have that team mission, but it's sometimes it doesn't get updated, sometimes it doesn't get translated, and or two, it's also are there specific nuance, values, importance that show up within teams within the larger system? And then how do we make sure that they go to what you were describing earlier? They still align with whatever the overarching kind of mission is. I think sometimes that gets maybe taken for granted.
You're exactly right. Leaders are that translational component. Of course, we have our values of the broader organization, but then what does that mean for me today? Some people will naturally get that, but some leaders need to make that connection for people so we can make work meaningful, or playing meaningful, or whatever they're doing meaningful, and help translate that. What are the values, but what do they look like for me, and how do I show up with them every day to meet the corporate objective or team objective?
Another thing that I remember you spoke about when we did our summit was, you were talking a lot about how what are these teams that in essence maybe outperform their potential per se, or maybe at least get as close as possible to that collective potential. And one of the threads that I remember you describing a little bit was the role of obviously the role that communication plays, particularly feedback in these types of teams and stuff. So I'm just curious how you all approach that, either whether it's from the assessment standpoint and or like things that you're encouraging leaders, astronauts, and so forth to be deliberate with in how they're communicating and how they're maybe giving feedback to make sure that the team is moving in the right direction.
hmm There's a couple of things that are just tried and true from the academic literature and the research that are gonna work. And one of them is to make sure you focus on the quality of communication, not just the quantity of communication. So sometimes people say, "Hey, did you talk to Zach today?" That's like a yes or no, but like, did you exchange the information you need? And really a lot of what we do in teams is exchanging information, and are you sharing the right information? There's something that happens in teams called the common information effect, where you tend to share what you have in common, not what you have unique, or not what's unexpected for the other person. And so making sure that you're a good listener and can ask questions that really are probing to like really get that person's perspective, or their unique inputs if it's a corporate team, And then it's that quality of exchange that's critically important. The other big thing that is just tried and true is the concept of debriefing. What do we do well? What do we need to do in the future? And part of that might be, what do we do well? What do we need to work on? And what do we need to do in the future? But keeping it future oriented. I always see this, with my kids play youth sports, and sometimes a kid like messes up, and you see the coach like point out what they did wrong. And I'm like, it's so I watch a lot of hockey, and it's like the kid knows that they whiffed on the blue line. The puck went by. I'm like, you don't have to point that part out. What you have to point out is, now what do you do moving forward? And that piece is just left off so often. And so debriefing as a team really does that. It really has that future forward focus. So yeah, I mean, you have to kind of understand what happened a little bit, to troubleshoot it, but you can't dwell on that. It's always about, well, what do we need to change? What do we need to do moving forward? How can we better do this in the future? Very future focused is the way that works. So those would be my two things of like quick hacks to improve communication.
I love that. I was going through as you were describing it initially, that idea of like I could think through some of my relationships and settings I've been immersed in, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm very guilty of like we the conversations we have are oftentimes where there's overlap or where there are those shared interests, but being kind of thoughtful and how do you kind of build on those other areas that maybe we don't always discuss that are important. And then also the yes, a little cliche, but the idea of like that feed forward. Same
Yep.
thing. It applies across levels. Like athletes generally, like they know, where they've screwed up. I don't need to be reminded of it,
Yes.
but I
Yeah.
do want, okay, what's the how now as I move forward to fix or improve?
Yeah. And in fact, it's sometimes like, even sometimes you do need to, let the person know they didn't do it right. They might think it, but even the way you phrase it, hey, I noticed you doing this. Next time, try this. I've seen that be a really effective way to make contact or whatever.
Hmm.
It just gets them out of this like hyper focus on what went wrong, because it's never what we need. We don't need the hyper focus on that. That's in the past. No one can change that now. We need people to hyper focus on how to be their best in the future.
Mm, love that. Yeah, that's a really, really great reframe. Yeah, we we got enough telling us where we're lacking all around us oftentimes, or we're again our own maybe inner voice too. So we don't need any more of that. You mentioned earlier this, I think fascinating. Obviously Artemis has gotten a lot of attention recently, Artemis 2, but also there's this other project that you mentioned that's been this simulation over a year of in simulating Mars, and I want to. Hopefully, I'm not butchering it. Chapea or Chapea. I don't know how
Yeah,
you're
yep, yep.
Chapea. Okay, I would love to know just when you think there's so much that goes into obviously a project that you all are looking at, that you're studying, you're paying attention to, as it relates to some of the things that we've talked about here. How important is it to simulate that environment and to start to like where's if possible some of the things that you all are really maybe trying to shine a spotlight on in that project?
Yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about that project for framing, and then we can talk about how it applies. But we have a project called CHAPIA, Crew Health and Performance Exploration Analog, and we have crews of four in isolation and confinement for 378 days. While they're in that situation, we mimic the Mars resource restrictions that we'll expect. So limited food supply, limited water, communication delay of anywhere from 12 to 24 minutes each way. And what this is really doing is mimicking what we expect the communication delay for Mars. So they're living in this resource restricted environment. We collect all sorts of data, whether it's their sleep patterns and movements and how they're eating and their, just everything, their cognitive function, their behavioral performance, the way they work in a team. Um, but what's really important about that data is that we give this integrated look so we can make, in NASA terms, what we call risk and resource trades. So when you send someone to space, some to Mars someday, every ounce of payload on that space vehicle matters. So I might create the most fabulous behavioral health VR intervention, but should I send that? Or should we just send more food so they don't fight? And so figuring out like what the different trades are being made. Um, even we mimic that because we want to mimic the psychological fidelity and the physical fidelity as much as possible, so that we can understand what it's like to go to Mars, because the first time we'll be in Mars on Mars is the first time we'll be on Mars, so we have to learn and prepare as best as we can ahead of time. I think some interesting parallels for the type of work you do is oftentimes in an organization we have resource restrictions. It's not necessarily food and water, sometimes it is though, but it's not necessarily those things. But whether it's a salary cap or whether it's that you just have different limitations with the way farm teams are feeding in or whatever, it could be different resource restrictions. You might have like times, I think with sports right now, a fascinating thing with team composition and training is the transfer portal. I keep meaning to write an article on how like the stuff I do applies to that. And I just need to find the time, but that is a new system limitation and opportunity, right? It's the reality of the world now. And so in the same way that we'll look at like, well, what are Mars resource restrictions? People have to look at, in my organization, in my context, what are resource restrictions? What can change? What can't? And then within that, where do I need to make trades? So do I select a little bit better, and then spend less time training? Or am I okay with developing people along the way? What are risks with that? And then, spend more time, more dollars on my training program. Or, maybe I have unlimited resources, but it just depends. And so figuring out what your constraints are and then where to make those trades, what to prioritize within those trades is really important for our talent management. Um, Whether it's astronauts that go to Mars someday or really in organizations is really operating within those constraints and using them wisely and prioritizing within them to make those trades. The other thing is that physical and psychological fidelity. You prepare as best you can, for something like Mars. And so I think that, in sports, it's the same thing. I might mentally prepare, I might physically prepare, but there's so much that's dynamic that the person has to be ready in that moment to produce, right? And so all you can do is prepare them as best as you can for that moment. And that's what we're doing with our Mars cruise, is saying, okay, we can't prepare for everything. So what do? We prepare them as best as possible by selecting well, by training well, by give them the resources that they need. But then ultimately, we need to think about creating a team and ensuring the individual is adaptable to whatever comes their way. So whether it's, overtraining for mental stamina so they can go into a difficult spacewalk and perform in that moment because they're so comfortable with it because they've overtrained in it. That might be one thing that helps prepare them for the dynamic situations that they'll face. And so it's like really about preparation and then almost letting it go in the moment, because the human will actually have to be the one that responds and adapts to that environment.
We could have spent the whole, I think, interview unpacking this a little bit more. I find this really interesting, and I love you tied this really well back into what you mentioned at the beginning. Just one of those competencies that obviously matters immensely is that adaptability, that resilience of the astronaut. But then to your point, I wanted to ask you about, when you're talking about the stakes that are involved and the consequences involved and just the amount of uncertainty. And then yet we also know how much uncertainty wreaks havoc on us from a psychological standpoint, just as a human being. I was really interested to kind of hear how you all work through that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. That's, not the only way, but part of that is certainly how you are simulating these environments. And then I love the idea that like overload kind of training, making that preparation as best as we can. It's not going to be synonymous, or it's not going to look exactly in some cases, but we can, in essence, simulate as much as we can and find different ways to make it challenging or demanding to prepare you. So that way, when, like you said, that moment comes, I'm a big proponent that if you want to be adaptable in the moment, oftentimes that's directly related to how prepared you are in leading up to it. You know, it's easier to be adaptable if you've done the foundational work. So it's fun to kind of hear how that may show up in space too.
Mm. Yeah.
I
Positive, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then you know, I don't know if this will spark an add-on from you, but when you were talking about the trade-offs, the two things that came up for me in the world of sport is I think of this when it comes to like the resources, obviously with staff, for example.
Right.
We're in an era now where like most teams you look around, they have a lot of the same types of roles. Now, the allocation of how many of people are maybe how big those departments are, how big those teams are, or how they are leveraged within the broader ecosystem of the organization, that looks a little bit different. But that was one thought that came to mind is, you know, as you're building out your staff, what are the trade-offs of do you put more chips into nutrition? Do you put more chips into analytics? Do you put more into scouting? You know, like there's that piece. And then the one other thing, this kind of ties into your NIL comment of, you know, we saw it applies to college too, but in pro sport years ago, after COVID, they condensed the roster sizes down
Mhm.
in professional baseball. And as a byproduct of that, you had less players that what were typically considered in the baseball term. You had these like organizational players, like these guys that are like kind of the journeymen. You know, they're the guys that are like really good teammates. Oftentimes, they're really versatile. They can play multiple positions, so they can kind of fill in gaps for you. Those types of players have become less commonplace in some ways because of the truncation of the roster. But the trade-off of is like those now you're gambling a little bit more for maybe higher upside, more talent, younger players, but you also had a lot of value and sometimes that veteran organizational presence and that versatility. So that to me just, you know, for those listening, I could see that being maybe where there's a commonality in what you were describing.
Yes, and I love what you're saying because I think the lesson here is to be deliberate in those things, right? So if I'm losing my veteran players, where are my younger players being mentored, and how are they receiving that support that they used to get? So the system changes, right? Or
Yeah.
if you think about, like you said, everybody has kind of the same profile of staff, and and but every team is trying to outperform the other team. That's the whole point of competition, right? You are trying to outperform that. And so what you have to think about is, how am I uniquely positioned to do that? And so it could be that everybody has the same staffing, so it's not going to be on that. But where are you deriving your like sustained competitive advantage? If you can't spend the money on players that someone else can, then it's through your development. You better be the best at developing players, or figuring out how to get the best out of people who don't command as high salaries. But that has to become your thing that you do as an organization, because that's the way you survive and compete. And so I love that about sports. Is actually the same in organizations, is they're always trying to identify their sustained competitive advantage in the marketplace. What can we do that will let us outperform everyone else in the marketplace? And that's the same for organizations, and it's the same for professional sports. It's just what's fun about sports is you actually see it play out in a field, whereas in corporations you just see it in their changes in their um, different financials and things like that. But for sports, we like to gather around and actually watch it happen before us, who has a sustained competitive advantage.
Yeah, talk about beautiful feedback. At least hopefully in some cases. Sometimes that feedback's not what you want, or you're like, oh, okay, we'll make an adjustment, or maybe we need to
Yeah.
change the system. But again, that's maybe the beauty of it. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to make sure that I asked you about in our conversation. I think one that I found really interesting, and this ties into what maybe you shared at the beginning. I think you intentionally use that word readiness and the role that that plays from a mental, psychological standpoint, for physical standpoint, for these astronauts. And I've heard you talk about this in other contexts, kind of the the role of self-care too, and what role that plays. I would just be interested if you could talk a little bit about those as they relate to leaders in particular, and just kind of how important that is in a team
Yeah,
setting.
self-care is incredibly important, whether it's in space or with other teams. So self-care, particularly in space, is a main thing. The idea is that you have to ensure that you're ready and that you are taken care of so that you can contribute to the team. If you are not eating properly, working out properly, sleeping properly, I'm not going to bring my best to the team, and then I probably might even be a tax on the team. And so making sure that you can be a contributor does take self-care. And that's true in our lives, right? Like when we're sleep deprived and working too much and we have a short fuse, that doesn't do our family relationship service. And so taking care of yourself is important in all these different contexts. One of the things that's needed to do that is just for an individual to monitor their readiness. Some people are not very good at that. This concept of, am I ready to contribute, or do I need to give myself a break? For some reason, we've kind of all grown up with this, like, just work harder, just work yourself to death, work, like 4 hours a night of sleep is great. We praise these people, and it's like, that's terrible, like, for many reasons. But that is not a sustained way to have someone who can contribute to your team. It's just not. And there's lots of data, lots of information that would show, the cognitive performance declines. And so we've tricked ourselves in to not considering the fact of whether or not we're ready to be a top performer. And so that's that concept of taking care of yourself, but also monitoring yourself appropriately, noticing when you first get snippy, or when you are slower to make decisions, or when you're distracted at work and need to take a break. It's okay to take a break, and you come back and you're refreshed, and you're able to do more than you would have if you would have just plowed through. Plowing through is not the way to long-term success. Plowing through happens sometimes. We all have to do it once in a while, but plowing through is not a long-term success recipe. Coaches need to model this themselves. They need the part of one of our most supported theories of leadership is called transformational leadership. And one of the things there is that part of that is that the individual serves as a role model. We aren't necessarily role models in all ways as leaders, but when people see us as that role model and someone they can look up to, it helps inspire them. That, with given some individualized consideration, like we talked about earlier, and having like a compelling direction, some transformative goals, that goes a long way to inspiring people. And when you're talking about players or team members in an organization, that inspiration component, people need that purpose, people need that drive, and taking care of yourself and helping to role model some of these behaviors can really help. I realize not all coaches and leaders can like work out every day like our athletes do, but modeling some of the other behaviors, dedication, taking care of oneself, ensuring they leave time for family, these important things that create a healthy individual who can contribute best to the team.
You were describing, you can't plow through. It made me think of like, yes, there might be seasons, however long, little moments, periods of time where maybe that is sort of quote unquote required. But to sustain that and then to sustain your impact as a leader, that is not a recipe that obviously works, whether it's in space or sport or anything.
No,
The
and to add to that, we do have those moments. And if you've already spent it, if you're already depleted moving into that moment, you're not going to be able to address that moment. And we do have to save it for those moments, so that we can tackle those moments when they do come.
Which ties in really well to you talking about just even just being aware of yourself in the first place. Like I'd imagine, like when you're depleted, much harder to then be aware of where you are getting impatient, where you are maybe being triggered, or maybe where you are showing up in a way that is different than how you normally might. The other thing that I wanted to ask a little bit about is you kind of touched on this a little bit when you were describing the Mars simulation, Chapia, but part of this is I'm thinking about we know how important your support system is. it comes to managing stress and just really in any aspect of life. I'm curious how, thinking about coaches, thinking about leaders, how important is that for them to, in whatever way, be thoughtful, be intentional about who that ecosystem is around their players, around their teams, and are there things that maybe you advise or that you've seen to kind of help with that?
Yeah, it definitely should be deliberate. There is lots of research that would suggest the social support we get from whether it's our team or our supervisor or our friends and family does contribute it to our stress as well as some other outcomes like team performance, unit performance. Lots of studies like that in the military too. That's another place where that social support aspect's important. Um, Really, what seems to make the difference is that someone is getting that support, that someone is getting their emotional needs met, that they are getting their instrumental needs met. So, someone who's helping them to achieve their goals. Um, People tend to look for it from different sources, but I think really what's important is that it is available. And so what can happen is people can come from all walks of life, right? And so it could be like on a sports team, someone's come from a place where they did not receive much familial support for what they were doing. And then the question needs to come is where is that person going to get that support when they're frustrated, when they are not their goals are frustrated when they need it, where are they going to get that? And if they don't get that, they're going to find it somewhere, and sometimes it can be an unhealthy behaviors. So just thinking through, like, where are those support sources? Are they there? And if they're not there, can we provide that through a mentoring program, through a coach who takes a little more time out for people type things. The people have different styles, so making sure that person has a good fit there, keeping appropriate boundaries and stuff like that, but just ensuring that they're getting the correct social support where needed.
Beautiful. And I kind of want to bring us to the end here, to the close. I'm super grateful for your time. It's been fun for me to get to hear and follow from afar to just everything that you've been in essence building and part of and helping kind of spearhead in your work. So I'm again appreciative of you taking some time. We've covered a lot in a lot of ways, and we're trying to so much of this, what we're describing, obviously can be contextual. However, I'm also, I'm curious if there's anything that maybe we haven't hit on yet that you think can be valuable, practical for coaches and leaders that are listening, whether this ties into teamwork, whether this ties into any other aspect of your work that, being mindful of who a lot of the people are that are tuning in to this conversation may not necessarily be working with people trying to go to space. But I'm interested if there's anything else that maybe we haven't touched on from a practical lens that somebody could go, implement from your expertise.
Oh boy, there's a lot. I mean, so there's quite a bit. Things that we haven't talked about. So one thing that is probably a gap sometimes is this concept that's really important for setting up a team of a compelling direction. That's one of the things that's needed to put the team in the right direction. Um, we think that in space it's very easy, right? It's like compelling direction, go to the moon. I mean, that's an easy mission to get behind and get excited about. Um, and what I can see, but is sometimes it's that translational component that people need to understand. Well, how does that trickle down into my current behaviors? And so in our work, we talk about it as like more proximal performance behaviors that lead to this long-term mission success. So yes, we want a safe mission. We want to land on the moon. But what are the kind of performance behaviors that are needed to get there and to do that safely? I think the same could be said in things like professional sports. Like everybody wants to win, right? Can I say that? Is that allowed on your podcast that says live
It
better
is
too?
it is in the title. Yeah, yeah, but there's a
Yeah.
reason why it's listed first.
Okay. I just don't want to get in trouble. But yeah, but
Yeah.
but but everybody wants to win. So that's not the compelling direction. That is the compelling direction, but that is what everybody is trying to do. So as a leader, how do you translate that into the performance behaviors that you need from your team? So what does that look like? Let's come together for a team and say, what are we working on for this year? What's our three main goals we're going to do? Of course, win. But what does that look like for your team? Is it, and what's doable? What's a difficult but achievable goal? And to kind of rally the troops around that can really be compelling. And I think sometimes people don't make deliberately make that translational piece that really most workers, most team members, most players kind of can do, but a really inspirational leader can help do that.
I love the differentiation. It's not just the what in terms of obviously that destination that we're moving towards, where you said whether it's the moon, whether it's winning a championship, but it's kind of the how too. And then also I think to your point, illuminating, connecting that vision to how is that showing up day to day in the moment with all of our respective roles and how we're obviously contributing to that. So I think that's it's a really nice way to bring it to a close. Like you, again, whether you're talking about trying to put people into space, put people on the moon, put people onto Mars, or win championships, a little different consequences, a little different stakes in in a sense. But it's been, again, I'm super appreciative of you peeling back the curtain a little bit of the amazing work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, and the impact that you're having. So, Suzanne, again, I just want to thank you again for your time and what you were willing to share here today.
Oh, thank you, Zach. Appreciate you having me.